Chapter 1, The Committee Room. The fluorescent lights in room 2318 of the Rayburn House office building had been humming for 11 hours straight. It was the kind of sound that burrowed into your skull, not loud enough to complain about, but persistent enough to make everything feel slightly unreal by midnight. Sarah Vance pressed her thumb and forefinger against her closed eyelids, trying to reset her vision. The words on her laptop screen had started bleeding together around 9 o'clock. Now, well past 1 in the morning, they seemed to crawl across the display like insects. "We're on Section 847, subsection D," droned Congressman Morrison from the head of the table, his voice carrying the mechanical quality of a man who'd been reading legislative text for so long he'd forgotten how normal human speech sounded. "The provision regarding interdepartmental coordination protocols during states of declared emergency." Sarah was 34 years old and had spent the last 9 years working as a legislative analyst for the House Appropriations Committee. She'd reviewed thousands of pages of bills, amendments, continuing resolutions, and omnibus packages. She knew the rhythm of these marathon sessions. The Defense Authorization Bill came up every year, and every year it turned into an endurance test. 1,000 pages of dense legal language authorizing military spending, intelligence operations, and a sprawling network of programs that touched every aspect of national security. The room held 12 people, though only 7 were still truly conscious. 3 congressional staffers had their eyes open but hadn't moved in 20 minutes. A legislative counsel was typing something, but Sarah suspected she was actually online shopping. Only Morrison, his chief of staff David Chen, the committee's senior Republican member Congressman Harding, and Sarah herself seemed to be genuinely following along. And even that was generous. "Can we just flag this section for technical review and move on?" Harding asked, not bothering to hide his exhaustion. He was 67 and had been in Congress for 22 years. These late-night sessions were harder on him now than they used to be. Sarah could see the way he shifted in his chair every few minutes, trying to find a position that didn't make his back ache. "We need to at least read it into the record," Morrison replied, though there was no real conviction in his voice. This was ritual, not diligence. The bill would pass. It always passed. The Defense Authorization Bill was considered must-pass legislation, essential for keeping the military funded and operational. Voting against it was political suicide, and everyone in Washington knew it. Which meant that what mattered wasn't whether the bill would become law, but what ended up buried inside it. Sarah took a sip of her coffee. It had gone cold hours ago, but the bitterness helped her focus. She'd developed a system over the years. When her attention started to drift, she'd force herself to actually read every third paragraph carefully, really parse the language. It was the only way to catch the things that slipped through. She watched Morrison's lips move as he read, but her eyes were on her own copy of the text, following along. Section 847 dealt with emergency coordination between the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and various intelligence agencies. Standard stuff. The kind of bureaucratic framework that looked important but mostly just formalized what already happened informally. Subsection D specified protocols for information sharing. Subsection E addressed command structure clarifications. Subsection F outlined reporting requirements. Subsection G. Sarah stopped. She read the paragraph again, more slowly this time. Then a third time. In circumstances where the President determines that traditional constitutional oversight mechanisms would materially impede the response to an extraordinary threat to national security, the executive branch may implement necessary protective measures, subject to retrospective review, with standard procedural requirements suspended for the duration of the designated threat period. She felt something cold settle in her stomach. The language was deliberately murky, that much was obvious. But underneath the bureaucratic fog, the meaning was stark. If the President declared something an extraordinary threat, standard procedural requirements could be suspended. No specification of what those requirements were. No definition of what constituted an extraordinary threat. No explanation of who would conduct the retrospective review or what authority they'd have. It was a blank check, dressed up in the gray language of committee text. Sarah glanced up at Morrison. He'd already moved on to section 848, his voice unchanged, still that same monotonous drone. She looked at Chen, who was scrolling through his phone. At Harding, whose eyes were half closed. No one had noticed. Or maybe they had noticed and hadn't cared. After 11 hours, at 1:30 in the morning, with 600 more pages still to go, who had the energy to fight over one paragraph? Sarah's heart was beating faster now. She opened a new document on her laptop and copied the text of subsection G, then pulled up the previous year's Defense Authorization Bill for comparison. She searched for similar language. Nothing. This was new. She thought about raising her hand, interrupting Morrison mid-sentence, pointing out the extraordinary breadth of power that this single paragraph would grant. But even as the thought formed, she felt the weight of the room pressing down on it. Everyone here was exhausted. Everyone wanted to finish and go home. If she flagged this now, it would mean another hour of debate minimum, probably longer. Morrison would be annoyed. Chen would be furious. And in the end, what would change? The bill would pass anyway. That was the genius of it, she realized. Bury something like this in a 1,000-page must-pass bill, introduce it at 1 in the morning when everyone's too tired to think straight, and even if someone notices, the institutional momentum is too strong to stop. Sarah's fingers hovered over her keyboard. Morrison had moved on to section 849. She took another sip of cold coffee and told herself she'd bring it up in the morning, when everyone was fresh. When cooler heads could prevail. When there'd be time for proper discussion. But even as she made this promise to herself, some deeper part of her knew she wouldn't. Because by morning, the moment would have passed. The bill would have cleared committee. The machinery of government would have already moved forward, and one more paragraph of dense legislative text would have slipped into law unnoticed, like a seed planted in dark soil, waiting for the right conditions to grow. Chapter 2, The Morning After. Sarah didn't sleep well. She never did after the marathon sessions, but this time it wasn't just the caffeine or the fluorescent light hangover. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that paragraph, the words rearranging themselves in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She gave up trying around 6 and went for a run along the mall. The January air was sharp enough to hurt her lungs, but the pain felt clarifying. Washington was quiet at this hour, just a few other joggers and the early shift workers making their way to offices that never really closed. The monument stood pale against the dawn sky, and Sarah found herself thinking about the men who built this city, who designed these systems of checks and balances that everyone talked about like they were carved in stone rather than written in ink that could be amended, revised, or quietly rewritten in the middle of the night. By 8:30 she was at her desk in the Longworth building, her hair still damp from the shower, working her way through emails. The defense bill had cleared committee at 4 in the morning. It was already moving to the full House floor for a vote scheduled in 3 days. "You look like hell," said Marcus Webb, dropping into the chair across from her cubicle. Marcus was another legislative analyst, 5 years younger than Sarah but already developing the permanent squint of someone who spent too much time reading fine print. 11-hour session, Sarah said, not looking up from her screen. Morrison's committee? Marcus shook his head sympathetically. "I heard Chen almost fell asleep standing up." Sarah opened the final version of the bill that had been posted overnight. She navigated to section 847, subsection G. The language was identical to what she'd read in the committee room, but now it had been assigned an official designation, 847, G, 2B. A string of numbers and letters that made it seem technical, procedural, forgettable. "You ever read something in a bill that just felt wrong?" she asked. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Every day. That's kind of the job, isn't it? Finding the stuff that feels wrong before it becomes law. But what if you find it and nobody cares?" He studied her face for a moment. "What did you find?" Sarah turned her monitor so he could see. She watched his eyes move across the text, once, then again. His expression didn't change much. Marcus had a good poker face, but she saw his jaw tighten slightly. "Jesus," he said quietly. "That's broad. Right? No definition of extraordinary threat. No specification of which procedural requirements get suspended. No timeline. Just," she gestured at the screen, "blank space for someone to fill in later. Did you flag it in committee?" The question hung between them. Sarah looked away. "It was 1:30 in the morning," she said. "Everyone was exhausted. I thought I'd bring it up today, but now it's already out of committee." Marcus rubbed his eyes. "Okay. So bring it to Morrison directly. He likes you. He'll listen." Sarah had already thought of this. She'd been thinking of little else since 6 that morning. But Morrison was up for re-election in a swing district. He'd spent the last 3 months emphasizing his strong national security credentials. Holding up the defense bill over one paragraph about executive authority. That was the kind of thing that ended up in opposition ads. "What if he knows?" Sarah asked. "Knows what? What if he already knows what this does? What if that's the point?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Then you need to decide if you're okay with that." After Marcus left, Sarah sat staring at her screen. She thought about her career trajectory, about the years she'd spent building credibility in this building. She thought about her mother, who'd worked as a paralegal for 30 years and had always told Sarah that the law mattered, that institutions mattered, that the rules were what kept society from sliding into chaos. She thought about that paragraph becoming law. Her phone buzzed. A text from David Chen, staff meeting at 10. Morrison's office. Sarah arrived at the meeting to find 8 other staffers already gathered in the cramped space. Morrison sat behind his desk, looking remarkably refreshed for someone who'd been awake until 4 in the morning. The man had a gift for compartmentalization that Sarah had never mastered. "Good work last night, everyone," Morrison began. "The bill's in good shape. Leadership's confident about the floor vote." He went through the schedule, the whip count, the amendments that might come up. Standard procedure. Sarah waited for the right moment. It didn't come. As people began filing out, she heard herself say, "Congressman, can I have a minute?" Morrison glanced at his watch but nodded. Chen remained in the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "It's about Section 847, Sarah said. Subsection G. The emergency authority provision." Morrison's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the quality of his attention. "What about it?" Sarah had prepared this speech during her run, had practiced it in her head a dozen times. But now, standing in this office with Morrison watching her and Chen's eyes boring into the side of her head, the words came out smaller than she'd intended. "The language is very broad. I'm concerned about the lack of definitions around what constitutes an extraordinary threat, or which procedural requirements could be suspended. It could be interpreted as granting a lot of discretionary power to the executive branch." Morrison leaned back in his chair. "It's an emergency coordination provision, Sarah. We need flexibility in crisis situations. You can't tie the president's hands when national security is at stake." "I understand that, sir. But there are no safeguards. No congressional oversight trigger. No. There's retrospective review," Chen interrupted. "It's right there in the text." "Retrospective review isn't oversight," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And it doesn't specify who conducts it or what authority they'd have." Morrison studied her for a moment. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that was meant to be reassuring but somehow wasn't. "Sarah, you're a smart analyst. That's why you're on my team. But sometimes smart people overthink things. This provision went through legal counsel. It went through the committee. Nobody else has raised concerns. Maybe nobody else read it carefully enough," Sarah said, and immediately regretted it. The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. "Are you suggesting," Morrison said, his voice still pleasant but with an edge underneath, "that I didn't read my own committee's bill carefully enough?" Sarah felt the moment slipping away from her. "No, sir. I think this deserves another look before the floor vote." Morrison stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I appreciate your diligence. I really do. But the bill is moving forward as written. If you have specific technical corrections, submit them to Chen in writing. Otherwise, we have bigger things to focus on." Sarah nodded and left. In the hallway outside, her hands were shaking. She'd tried. She'd raised the concern. She'd done her job. But even as she told herself this, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just watched something terrible begin, and had been powerless to stop it. Chapter 3, The Vote. The Defense Authorization Bill passed the House 3 days later with a vote of 351 to 84. It wasn't even close. Sarah watched from the gallery as the electronic board lit up with green votes, a cascade of yeas that made the outcome clear within the first minute. She'd spent those 3 days trying to sound the alarm. She'd written a detailed memo outlining her concerns and sent it to Chen, who'd acknowledged receipt with a 2-word email, noted. "Thanks." She'd reached out to staffers on the Senate Armed Services Committee, hoping they might catch what the House had missed. Most didn't respond. One wrote back saying they'd keep an eye on it, which Sarah understood to mean absolutely nothing. She'd even considered going outside official channels, reaching out to a journalist, maybe, or one of the government watchdog groups that monitored this kind of thing. But every time she started to draft that email, she thought about the non-disclosure agreements she'd signed, about the reputation she'd built, about how quickly someone could become unemployable in Washington once they got labeled as a leaker. So she'd done nothing, and now the bill was moving to the Senate, where it would almost certainly pass with similar margins. Marcus found her in the cafeteria that afternoon, picking at a salad she had no appetite for. "You okay?" he asked, sitting down across from her. "Fine," Sarah said automatically. "You're not fine. You've been walking around like a ghost for 3 days." She put down her fork. "That provision is going to become law, Marcus. In 2 weeks, maybe less, it's going to be sitting in the U.S. Code, and nobody except me seems to give a damn." "That's not true," Marcus said quietly. "I give a damn. I read the provision. I see what you see. Then why aren't you doing anything about it?" The question came out harsher than she'd intended, but Marcus didn't flinch. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Because I'm not sure what to do," he admitted. "I've been thinking about this a lot. And here's the thing, you're right that the language is broad. Dangerously broad. But it's also true that every administration for the last 50 years has claimed some version of emergency executive authority. This just codifies what's already been happening informally." "That's worse," Sarah said. "Don't you see? Making it official, writing it into law, that removes the last barrier. Before, a president had to at least justify emergency actions, face legal challenges, worry about constitutional pushback. Now they can just point to Section 847 and say Congress authorized it." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know. But Sarah, we're not elected officials. We're staffers. We can advise, we can warn, but ultimately we don't make the decisions. So we just watch it happen. We document it," Marcus said. "We keep the paper trail. We make sure that when someone asks, years from now, whether anyone saw this coming, the answer is yes. Someone saw it. Someone tried to stop it." Sarah wanted to throw something. The reasonableness of Marcus's position made it worse somehow. He wasn't wrong. He was being practical, measured, realistic. And she hated it. That night, alone in her apartment, Sarah did something she hadn't done since college. She called her mother. "Honey, it's late," her mother said, her voice thick with sleep. Is everything okay? I need to ask you something, Sarah said. About work. About doing the right thing. She heard her mother sit up, could picture her reaching for the lamp on the nightstand. What happened? Sarah told her everything. The late-night session, the paragraph she'd found, her failed attempts to raise concerns, the vote that had passed that morning. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she always had. What would you do? Sarah asked when she'd finished. If you were me? Her mother was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Sarah had never heard before. When I was your age, she said, I worked on a case, I never told you about this, where I found something in the discovery documents. A memo that proved our client had known about safety defects in their product for months before people started getting hurt. My boss told me to file it in the general documents, let it get lost in the thousands of pages we were turning over. What did you do? I did what he told me, her mother said. And 3 people died before the truth came out. I told myself I was just following orders, that I was being professional, that it wasn't my responsibility. But I've thought about those 3 people every day for the last 35 years. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. I'm not saying you should throw away your career, her mother continued. But I am saying that you have to live with your choices. And living with yourself, really living with yourself, that's harder than living with a ruined reputation. After they hung up, Sarah sat in the dark of her apartment for a long time. She thought about Section 847, G, 2b, about how something so small could contain so much danger. She thought about all the ways systems failed, not dramatically, but quietly, through 1,000 small compromises and reasonable-sounding justifications. She opened her laptop. The Senate would vote in 10 days. That gave her a window, narrow but real. She couldn't stop the bill, that ship had sailed, but she could make sure people understood what was in it. She could create a record that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Sarah began typing. Not a memo to Chen or Morrison. Not a carefully worded internal document that would disappear into a filing system. A detailed legal analysis. Names, citations, historical precedents, potential scenarios. Everything she'd been trained to do, but aimed at a different audience. She worked through the night, stopping only to verify sources and refine arguments. By dawn, she had 20 pages of tight, damning analysis. She saved the document. Then she opened her contacts and scrolled until she found the name she was looking for, Daniel Reeves, investigative reporter for the Washington Post. They'd met at a conference 2 years ago, had stayed in loose contact. He'd given her his card, told her to reach out if she ever saw something the public needed to know. Sarah stared at his email address. Her finger hovered over the keyboard. Everything she'd built, everything she'd worked for, balanced on this moment. She thought about her career, her reputation, the life she'd constructed in this city of carefully managed ambitions. Then she thought about her mother's voice in the dark, talking about 3 people who died while she'd stayed silent. Sarah attached the document and hit send. Then she closed her laptop, walked to her window, and watched the sun rise over Washington, wondering if she'd just saved something or destroyed everything, and knowing she wouldn't find out which until it was far too late to take it back. Chapter 4, The Breaking Point. Daniel Reeves called her at 7:30 that morning. Sarah had been expecting it, but the sound of her phone buzzing still made her jump hard enough to spill coffee on her kitchen counter. Sarah Vance. His voice was exactly as she remembered, quick, energetic, but with an undertone of caution. Reporters learned early not to seem too eager. Yes. I read your analysis. All of it. Twice, actually. A pause. This is legitimate. You're certain about the sourcing? Every citation is verifiable. The bill text is public record. You can confirm everything I wrote. That's not what I'm asking. Reeves's voice dropped lower. I'm asking if you're certain you want to do this. Because once I run this story, there's no walking it back. People will know it came from inside. They'll figure out it was you. Sarah looked around her apartment. She'd lived here for 6 years. Cream-colored walls, IKEA furniture, a small balcony where she grew herbs she never used. A careful, moderate life. I'm certain, she said, and was surprised to find it was true. The article went live at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The headline was stark: Hidden Clause in Defense Bill Grants Sweeping Emergency Powers to Executive Branch. Sarah was in Morrison's office when it hit. She'd gone there deliberately, had asked for a meeting to discuss an unrelated appropriations matter. She wanted to see his face when he found out. Some part of her, the part that had spent 3 sleepless nights watching her concerns get dismissed, needed to witness that moment. Chen burst in without knocking, his phone in his hand, his face flushed with anger. "We have a problem," he said. Then he saw Sarah and stopped. The recognition in his eyes was instant. She watched him put it together, the memo she'd written, the questions she'd asked, the timing of the article. His expression went from anger to something colder. "Get out," he said to Sarah. "David," Morrison started. "Get out." Sarah stood. Her legs felt steady, which surprised her. She'd thought she'd be shaking, but instead she felt a strange, light clarity. She walked past Chen, past Morrison's confused expression, and out into the hallway. She made it to her desk before her phone started ringing. The next 3 hours were a blur of accusations and denials. Chen called her into a conference room with Morrison and 2 people from the House Legal Counsel's office. They asked her direct questions about her contact with journalists. She invoked her First Amendment rights and said nothing. They threatened her with breach of confidentiality. She pointed out that everything in the article was based on public documents. "You had a duty," Morrison said, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely hurt rather than just politically calculating. "To this office. To the committee. To the process. I had a duty to the Constitution," Sarah said. "That's the oath we all took." "Don't you dare," Chen snapped. "Don't you dare act like you're some kind of hero. You're just a staffer with an agenda who decided the rules didn't apply to her." Maybe he was right. Sarah didn't know anymore. The clarity she'd felt an hour ago was fading, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. She'd broken ranks. She'd violated the unspoken code that made Washington function. And for what? The article was out, but would it change anything? By 6 o'clock, she had her answer. The story was spreading. Cable news had picked it up. Constitutional law professors were being interviewed. Civil liberties groups were issuing statements. And in the Senate, 3 members of the Armed Services Committee had announced they were requesting additional hearings on Section 847 before the floor vote. Sarah watched it unfold from her apartment, having been sent home, pending review of potential ethics violations, according to the formal email Chen had sent. Her phone kept buzzing with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Reporters, she assumed. She ignored them all except one. Sarah Vance. The voice was older, gravelly. "My name is Robert Henshaw. I'm a staff attorney with the Constitution Project. I've been reading about your situation." "I'm not giving interviews," Sarah said. "I'm not a reporter. I'm calling because what you did today, exposing this provision, that took real courage. And I'm calling because you're going to need a lawyer." Sarah's stomach dropped. "For what?" "They're going to come after you. Not today, probably not tomorrow, but soon. They'll look for any violation they can find, classified information exposure, breach of employment agreements, anything. And even if they don't find anything, the investigation itself can ruin you." He paused. "I'd like to represent you. Pro bono." "Why?" "Because someone needs to," Henshaw said simply. "And because what's in that bill, if people don't fight it now, we'll all regret it later." That night, Sarah stood on her balcony watching the city lights. Somewhere out there, senators were reading her analysis. Journalists were writing follow-up stories. Lawyers were preparing arguments. And in the morning, she'd probably lose her job. She thought about her mother, about those 3 people who died. She thought about Section 847, about all the ways that single paragraph could be used, or misused, in the years to come. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Marcus, Jesus Christ, Sarah. What did you do? She almost laughed. What had she done? She'd thrown a wrench into a machine that had been running smoothly for years. She'd violated every rule of Washington discretion. She'd probably destroyed her career for a principle that most people in this city had forgotten even existed. Another text came through, this one from a number she didn't recognize, "You're a traitor to this institution." Then another, from a different number, "Thank you. Someone needed to do this." Sarah turned her phone off and went inside. The defense bill vote was in 7 days. The article had bought some time, had forced a conversation that people hadn't wanted to have. But Washington had a way of absorbing scandals, of processing outrage into procedure, of turning emergencies into opportunities. She'd lit a fire. Now she'd find out if anyone would help her keep it burning, or if they'd all just wait for it to burn itself out. Chapter 5, The Aftermath. The Senate vote happened on a Tuesday morning, 17 days after Sarah had sent that email to Daniel Reeves. She watched it from a coffee shop 3 blocks from the Capitol, having been officially placed on administrative leave while the House Ethics Committee conducted their investigation. The final tally was 64 to 36. The Defense Authorization Bill, Section 847, G-2B, intact, became law. Sarah closed her laptop and stared at her reflection in the dark screen. She'd known this was the likely outcome, had known it from the beginning, really. But some part of her had held on to hope that the attention, the scrutiny, the public debate she'd forced would be enough to change course. It hadn't been. The hearings had happened. Constitutional scholars had testified about the breadth of the language. Civil liberties advocates had sounded alarms. 3 senators had even proposed an amendment to narrow the scope of the emergency powers provision. The amendment had failed 58 to 42. In the end, the same logic that had carried the bill through the House had prevailed in the Senate. It was a must-pass defense bill in an uncertain world. Nobody wanted to be seen as weak on national security. And one controversial paragraph, however troubling, wasn't worth holding up military pay, weapons systems, and intelligence operations. Sarah's phone buzzed. Robert Henshaw. "You saw?" he asked. "I saw. I'm sorry." "Don't be," Sarah said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. "We knew this was how it would probably go. The House Ethics investigation, I've been making some calls. It doesn't look good, Sarah. Chen's pushing hard. They're going to recommend termination, possibly refer it for criminal investigation." Sarah had been expecting this too. "What are my chances?" "In court?" "Pretty good, actually. You didn't leak classified information. Everything you shared was from public documents. But the process, the investigation, the legal fees, the time, that's the punishment, whether they win or not." After they hung up, Sarah sat in the coffee shop for another hour, watching people come and go. A young woman in a business suit, juggling a briefcase and a latte, rushed in and out. An older man settled into a corner with a newspaper. 2 college students argued good-naturedly about philosophy over pastries. Normal life, continuing all around her while she sat in the wreckage of her own. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus. "Where are you?" he asked. "Uncommon Grounds. The one on." "I know the one. Don't move." He arrived 20 minutes later, slightly out of breath. He bought a coffee and sat down across from her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "They're going to fire you," he finally said. "I know. Chen wants your head on a spike. He's been telling everyone you're a publicity-seeking ideologue who betrayed the institution. Am I? Sarah asked. It was the question that had been eating at her for weeks. Did I do the right thing, Marcus? Or did I just make myself feel better while accomplishing nothing? Marcus was quiet for a while, stirring his coffee absently. You remember what I said before? About documenting things, keeping a paper trail? Sarah nodded. I was wrong, Marcus said. Or not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. Documentation matters. But sometimes documentation isn't enough. Sometimes someone has to actually stand up and say, this is wrong, loudly enough that people can't ignore it. They ignored it anyway, Sarah pointed out. The bill passed. Did it, though? The same way it would have? Sarah frowned. What do you mean? Before your article, nobody was talking about Section 847. Now. It's in the congressional record. There are legal analyses published in major journals. 3 different civil liberties groups have filed position papers. And most importantly, everyone knows it's there. If some future president tries to invoke those emergency powers, they won't be able to do it quietly. There'll be immediate pushback, immediate scrutiny, because you made sure people were paying attention. That's a thin victory, Sarah said. Maybe. But it's the only kind we get sometimes. Marcus leaned forward. Sarah, Washington is full of people who know better and say nothing. Who see problems and justify their silence with practicality. You didn't do that. Maybe you didn't stop the bill, but you made them vote for it in daylight instead of darkness. That matters. After Marcus left, Sarah walked to the Lincoln Memorial. It was cold, the kind of February afternoon where the wind cut through even heavy coats, but she needed to move, to think, to process. She stood at the base of the monument, looking up at Lincoln's carved face, and thought about the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War. Emergency powers invoked during a genuine crisis, powers that had been controversial even then, that historians still debated. The difference was that Lincoln had acted in the midst of national dissolution, with rebels actually in arms against the government. Section 847 granted similar authority for any extraordinary threat a president chose to define. Her phone buzzed one more time. An email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thank you." Sarah almost deleted it, but something made her open it instead. Ms. Vance, you don't know me, but I'm a law student at Georgetown. I've been following the news about the defense bill and your role in exposing the emergency powers provision. I wanted you to know that in my con law seminar yesterday, we spent the entire class analyzing Section 847, G2B. Our professor, a former federal judge, said it was one of the most troubling expansions of executive authority he'd seen in his career. But he also said that without your whistleblowing, it would have passed completely under the radar, and the first time anyone examined it closely would have been after it was already being invoked. You gave us time to prepare, to understand, to build the case against its misuse before that happens. That matters. It may not feel like it now, but it matters. Thank you for your courage. A future lawyer who hopes to have your integrity. Sarah read the email 3 times. Then she put her phone away and started walking back toward her apartment. She'd lost her job. She'd burned her bridges in Washington. She had legal battles ahead and an uncertain future. The provision she tried to stop was now law, sitting there in the U.S. Code like a loaded gun waiting for someone to pick it up. But it wasn't hidden anymore. Someone, someday, would try to use Section 847, G2B. And when they did, there would be lawyers who'd studied it, journalists who'd written about it, citizens who knew to look for it. The fight she'd started wouldn't end with her. That was something. Maybe not enough, but something. Sarah walked home through the fading light, past the Capitol Dome and the office buildings where thousands of people were still working, still drafting legislation, still making the small compromises that kept the machinery of government running. Some of them would read what she'd written. Some of them would remember. And maybe, years from now, when it mattered most, one of them would stand up in a late-night committee meeting and say, "Wait, I need to read this paragraph more carefully." That was what she told herself, at least. It was enough to keep walking.